Welcome back to the Abide Project Synod 2024 update. I am Reverend Tyler Wagenmaker.
And I am the Reverend Cedric Parsels.
Cedric, last time we were having a conversation, we were at Lee Street Christian Reformed Church in the Wyoming area, which was a hosting church of Synod. But now we are actually on Calvin's campus because Synod has met this morning, first day one. Their plenary session, which always begins with worship and some kind of perfunctory sort of keeping of orders, housekeeping rules.
Yeah.
Yes, how they're going to deal with things. And so that's what they did this morning. They met at 8:15, and they met here, right at the chapel, which is right behind us.
Yes.
It was, we weren't quite sure everything we were going to expect this morning. I mean, some of the stuff always goes without question in terms of worship. So they began, Reverend Steve DeVries. He started from Lee Street, and he started out after everyone started out with some singing, English songs, Spanish-speaking songs, which is appropriate because last time we mentioned how Lee Street has two different types of ministries that take place, Spanish-speaking and English-speaking, under the roof of that church, a couple of different congregations. So that was reflected here in some of the singing as well by the delegates. And then Reverend DeVries just brought a message.
In fact, I would say he brought a catechism sermon.
Okay. What catechism comes to mind of what Reverend DeVries brought in his message?
Well, now you're testing me, but But he talked about the Lord's Days 54 through 56, I believe. Excuse me. Question and answer 54 through 56.
Okay, well, you even got very specific. That's even more than I was thinking. That's quite impressive, actually, Cedric.
Having to do with we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We believe in the communion of the saints and in the forgiveness of sins.
I see you let some of your Nicene Creed get into there. You inserted apostolic in there.
I did.
And that's good. That's good Nicene.
I just want the church to be so rooted in apostolic teaching.
That's
I just have to put it in there.
Yes, and that was a wonderful, refreshing, kind of bringing us back to what does the Catechism remind us of Scripture? What does it teach us? Who we are, the church. He brought out even this kind of delightful imagery of getting into the pool, but you always have to shower off. There's always these requirements, and so he kind of jokingly said, usually when I go to the pools, I know I'm clean. I don't need to shower off, but I'm glad everyone else has to shower off. So we all got showered.
Yes.
We got a little bit of the shower of being reminded before we're ready to before the delegates of Synod to jump into the pool.
Yes. So he took time to go through each of the catechism questions, and he sort of represented each of those questions as part of the washing.
Yeah.
So you could say that we were sprinkled 3 times.
But not rebaptized.
No.
We're not advocating rebaptism at all.
Some of us still, yes.
Okay, yeah. So, but then after that, after a time of worship, we then went right into power and privilege training, which Synod 2019 had mandated. Thrive, the Thrive ministry of the denomination, led that, talked the delegates through that. Really, it was almost like a type of a sermon from Reverend Baker, who led that and was talking about the grant, different 4 quadrants.
Yes, four quadrants.
Different quadrants of the square.
Different types of leadership styles, you might say.
Yes. And the big takeaway, of course, is what was he encouraging the delegates to be?
As always, Sean Baker is encouraging us to move up and to the right.
Up and to the right, yes. And that was.
Which is into the area where we are holding both grace and truth together. Right, and not seeing them as in conflict with one another, which is exactly right, which is what the Scriptures teach us. There is no conflict between truth and grace, and a large part of the power and privilege training is about basically encouraging people to make room for people to speak and to help people out. Many people. At one point, they asked all the new delegates or the first-time delegates to Synod to stand up, and there were, I would say,
just to acknowledge
them and
clap for them.
Yeah, and there was a good number of them. There were a lot of people who had been there before, but when you're the first-time delegate, you're sort of talking about the pool, right? You're gonna get into the shallow end before the deep end. You're not quite sure how things are gonna go, and so this is just to say, hey, you guys who are used to swimming in the deep end. help the guys in the shallow end of the pool to sort of get their feet wet and move forward.
Yeah, it's good working that analogy out even more in a way they didn't in there. You could have given the message, I think, Cedric, on there, the importance of that. So one of the, talking about kind of getting into the shallow end, working your way to the deep end, synods always start out slow. In terms of the delegates just getting their feet under them. They usually just don't jump right into things. And yet they were really asked to jump right into things right away, because the question is, who is synod this year? How is synod duly constituted with which delegates? There are a couple overtures that ask that very question, and synod was asked to make a determination on that. Now, the officers, or the president, Derek Buikema, he made a ruling early on. He said, we're going to do things in an ordinary and normal way the synods conduct business. There are some overtures dealing with that. Committees, the ones that the committee that's assigned to will kind of work through that. They'll come with a report to synod, probably early in synod, about who is seated, who is not seated. So he made a ruling. That ruling was challenged. And in fact, he invited that always too. He said, just in general, it's not personal. Doesn't mean you don't love me or you dislike me. This is just how we're going to conduct business. And these are kind of the rules. And I won't always make the accurate call necessarily. And the body might overrule me. And so someone rose to challenge. A delegate from Iacota put forward another option for the delegates.
Right.
And essentially it asked for the unseating of delegates from churches that are publicly affirming churches,
right.
Which means that externally, maybe through social media, through their websites, through pronouncements, they have said they've taken a position which is contrary to the confessional position of the Christian Reformed Church in regards to matters of sexuality and those kind of relationships.
And there is something of a spectrum among them. Some of them have basically said, we disagree with the confession on this issue, on the issue of homosexual sex being unchaste. So that's just a statement. We are, as a church, in disagreement with the confession. And now there's an open question about whether or not that's permissible. And that's what Synod will be deciding this year, God willing. But there are some churches where they've gone beyond that. And they've said, not only do we disagree with what Synod has said the confessions say, but we are actually going to act in opposition to what the confessions say. And what's interesting about that is that regardless of how you fall on the issue of confessional difficulty gravamina, if you read the majority report and the minority report from last year, I think my take on it is that both sides of that would say, you know what, you can't do that. That's not acceptable.
Right.
That's breaking the covenant within our churches. And so the member from Iacota, the delegate from Iacota, wanted Synod to basically say, if you're from one of those churches, if you're a delegate and you come from one of those churches, you can't in good conscience rise in agreement with the public form of agreement, which is the covenant for office bearers at Synod. Right.
And so the chair was challenged, his ruling, and they took a voice vote, and it sounded very split. Which was quite something actually in many ways, because as I mentioned, Synod usually starts very slowly, and it just doesn't jump into things, especially almost a little bit contentious sort of things right away, but they were asked to make a decision right away in regards to that. And that after being told essentially in a sermon that you all have to get along. And then the chair saying we're going to try to get along through the normal processes of things. And then so the burden was really on some of these delegates to rise and to say, we have an issue. Can we even get along? Because there are some who are in just outright rebellion, some congregations in outright rebellion, and some delegates from those congregations here. Should they be here in good conscience?
Right. And part of the issue is that the public form of agreement says, just like the covenant of office bearers says, that those who stand in support of it are saying that they believe that all the doctrines contained in our confessions, including the ones that Synod says are there, are in full agreement with the Word of God, which is obviously not the case. They don't believe that if they have these confessional difficulty gravamina, or if their churches especially have come out in opposition to and also them standing saying that they're in full agreement with the decisions. Exactly. And so they obviously are not. Yeah. Otherwise, their churches would not be taking those positions. Right. It's one of those situations where it's you keep using that word agreement. I'm not sure it means what you think it means.
Exactly. Now, but one thing the president, Derek Buikema, did say is he read the agreement, and he said, if you have an issue, if you cannot in good conscience, and really that's where he put the burden of responsibility on, he appealed to delegates' consciences on there. Can you in good conscience actually stand? And if you cannot, come speak to us as officers, and we will try to work a way forward. And so the opportunity was given to stand. Oh, by the way, there was a vote that eventually went to an electronic vote. I don't think we got there.
Well, yeah. So you mentioned that there was this request to actually discuss the issue of who should be can these people who are delegated from these churches, who are in opposition to the denomination publicly, can those people be seated? And so the chair said, well, that motion is ruled out of order because we're going to do things in the orderly and traditional way of doing things.
Yes.
And that was challenged. And then they had a vote on whether or not to sustain the chair, to go with what the chair had said. And it was very close.
Very close vote.
So close in terms of a voice vote that they had to go to electronic voting.
Yes.
And that is what is so interesting about, you're talking about jumping into the deep end.
Yeah.
That sort of signaled that there's quite a number of people they're out of the shallows. They're ready to go a little bit deeper.
They
already.
are.
You know,
and which is it's kind of out of character for Synod to say. And in many ways, it does put forward that the delegates are very aware and increasingly will be made aware of the implications of what does it mean to be in covenant together? What does it mean to have broken covenant and broken fellowship? What does that look like?
Now, ultimately,
the implications of it.
Ultimately, that electronic vote sustained the chair.
It did, yes.
So now the issue itself is not going away.
No.
Right? So there's a committee that will be addressing, as the president said, that will be addressing that very issue today and tomorrow, especially. I would think, hopefully, mostly today,
and making a recommendation that Synod will then take up and act on. So
the issue is not going away.
And so, but they did have to still arise, stand in agreement. There were some who did not. Some who were members of those churches who rose in agreement. So, but some who did not. And so that again, the appeal to the conscience, I was thankful in many ways for those who said, I can't stand in good conscience. I'm thankful that they didn't just go along to get along,
and because with real integrity,
and which is important. And then with that, then it helps us to be able to have an actual, real, good conversation, a truthful conversation about things as well going forward. The delegates,
and those who did not rise are going to have a private conversation with the officers of Synod to, as the president said, to sort of chart the way forward. To see whether or not they can continue to serve in good conscience. At Synod.
I'm curious where that will go, because that's in some ways a little bit unprecedented. I can't think of where that has happened before on that kind of level. And in some sense, I don't know if the officers are fully realizing they're setting precedent, perhaps, going forward. I don't know if they wanted to take that on themselves by doing this, but rather than letting the body kind of make that determination, maybe there's value in letting the body actually have that debate, because they didn't debate the motion that Iacota put forward. They didn't get a chance to debate that and even flush that out. So things will work their way out the way they do at Synod.
Now, there were some people who later, when right before the public declaration of standing, there were some people who at that point rose and wanted to go back to that motion.
One delegate in particular did.
And wanted to say, no, how can you do this with integrity? And the moment had already passed.
Did it pass?
Right? So
in some stages you want to say, you should speak up beforehand when the matter was before the body in a more formal way. That's some of the delegates just need. Delegates just need to kind of warm themselves up into. It's hard to just jump into things right away, and they were asked to do that, and that's why it's always a little awkward at the start of Synod to do these sorts of important decisions.
And as people get more used to being in the room together and know each other a little bit better, I think they'll They'll get the hang of it.
Yes. There was one other objection that was made to the ruling of the officers, that some overtures that were sent, later overtures that were actually communications, and they said these would be they would be received as communications, not as overtures, because no new grounds were presented. That was challenged. Some spoke to it on the floor, and the body overwhelmingly voted to uphold the decision of the officers to say, nope, these are communications. Specifically, they were overtures that were to be received now as communications that were challenging the decision of Synod last year.
And even Synod 22.
And 2022 in regards to human sexuality and the confessionality. And in many ways, that communicates, Cedric, that Synod is saying this is a settled and binding issue.
Right.
We're not revisiting this. There are no new grounds. We know who we are as a denomination on this. Now, what is this Synod going to essentially decide?
Right. It's not the issue. This is settled.
Yes.
Right. We're not going to revisit that. Now the question is, how are we going to live into the decisions that have been made at 22 and 23?
Yes.
That's the conversation we're having now. And so...
So committees will meet for a couple days, and they will really kind of delve into the work of the committees, the results of that, starting on Monday. Mm-hmm. And so we will also then have some regular updates as Synod goes along and just kind of reflect on it ourselves together. Yeah. So we'll look forward to that time.